I'm not sure if I want to have kids. Those few words landed like a shockwave. Rash sat there expecting another difficult conversation about wedding plans or the prenup, but this was something else entirely. His face changed in an instant. The future he thought he was building suddenly looked uncertain. The wedding was no longer the biggest question. Their entire relationship was. But the bigger surprise wasn't what she said. It was how long she had kept it to herself. Only days earlier, this couple looked like they were trying to recover from one obstacle after another. The prenup had already created tension between them. Neither of them handled that discussion easily. Yet they both kept saying they wanted to move forward. Time, though, refused to slow down. The 90-day clock kept ticking, and every sunrise meant fewer chances to fix problems before walking down the aisle. Mallorie knew there were loose ends hanging over the relationship, but she still had practical wedding plans waiting for her. One of the biggest jobs left on the list was finding a dress. With only 42 days remaining on the visa timeline, there wasn't much room for delays. Wedding planning usually brings excitement. Instead, this one carried pressure from every direction. She headed out with friends hoping to check one thing off her list. Looking at dresses should have been a break from the stress. For a little while, it almost looked like it worked. She smiled while trying different styles, listened to opinions, and seemed happy with several options. Anyone walking into the boutique without knowing the situation might have thought this was a normal bride preparing for a happy wedding. Then the mood shifted so quickly that even her closest friends stopped smiling. One simple question changed everything. How are you feeling about the wedding? Instead of talking about dresses, flowers, or guest lists, Mallorie admitted there was something much bigger hanging over her relationship. She explained that there was a conversation she had avoided for years. Not weeks. Not months. Years. She even admitted this discussion should have happened near the beginning of their relationship. That confession immediately raised eyebrows. Her friends tried to understand what could possibly be serious enough to threaten an entire wedding. One even wondered whether there had been cheating. Mallorie quickly made it clear that wasn't the issue. According to her, the truth was even bigger than that. Think about how heavy those words sound when there are only weeks left before a wedding. Everyone around her instantly realized this wasn't ordinary pre-wedding stress. The closer she came to explaining herself, the more impossible it became to imagine this conversation ending peacefully. At the center of all this sat one uncomfortable reality. Rash had traveled across countries believing both of them were moving toward the same future. Marriage isn't only about one ceremony. It is about shared plans, shared dreams, and shared expectations. If one person has been carrying a major unanswered question while the other believes everything is settled, the problem grows larger with every day that passes. From Rash's perspective, nothing suggested a conversation of this size was waiting around the corner. He had already accepted difficult discussions about finances. He had already adjusted to life in another country. He believed those challenges were part of building a future together. Mallorie, though, knew another conversation had been quietly following them through every milestone of their relationship. Every plan they made. Every promise they discussed. Every step closer to marriage. She later explained that fear played a huge role in staying silent. Fear of losing the relationship. Fear that the truth would push Rash away. Fear that once certain words were spoken, there would be no way to take them back. Fear explains silence. It does not erase the consequences of it. Because while one person is protecting the relationship, the other keeps making life-changing decisions without knowing the complete picture. That is exactly why this situation feels so different from ordinary wedding nerves. This wasn't about choosing a venue. This wasn't about signing a prenup. This wasn't about family disagreements. According to Mallorie herself, this was a conversation she should have had from the very beginning. And after carrying it for years, she finally decided Rash deserved to hear the truth, even if hearing it might cost both of them the wedding they had been working toward. Wedding dress shopping usually feels like one of the happiest parts of the journey. Friends laugh, opinions fly around the room, and for a few hours the stress of planning fades into the background. At first, that was exactly how things looked for Mallorie. She tried on different dresses, listened to her friends, and found several styles she genuinely liked. It was one of the few moments where she seemed excited about the wedding itself. But beneath every smile sat one thought she could no longer ignore. Her friends noticed it almost immediately. Mallorie wasn't acting like someone who was simply overwhelmed by seating charts or wedding budgets. There was a heaviness in the way she answered questions. Even while standing in front of mirrors wearing wedding gowns, her mind was somewhere else entirely. When they asked how she was feeling, the conversation changed direction almost instantly. Instead of talking about fabrics or colors, Mallorie admitted there was something she had to tell Rash before they could get married. She didn't describe it as a difficult conversation. She described it as something so serious there might not even be a wedding afterwards. That single admission changed the atmosphere. Her friends stopped thinking about dresses and started thinking about damage control. One of them even asked whether she had cheated, simply because they couldn't imagine what else could threaten the relationship this close to the ceremony. Mallorie quickly shut that idea down. No, this wasn't about another person. According to her, this issue carried even more weight because it had been sitting quietly between them for years. Every second she delayed explaining herself made the mystery feel even bigger. She admitted this was a conversation she should have started when the relationship first began. Hearing those words, it became easier to understand why her friends looked stunned. If something belongs in the first chapter of a relationship but doesn't appear until the final chapter before marriage, anyone would wonder why. Mallorie explained she had stayed silent because she feared the outcome. She believed bringing up the subject earlier might have ended the relationship before it had the chance to grow. That fear is something many people understand. Nobody enjoys risking the person they love. Nobody wants to hand someone a reason to walk away. At the same time, fear doesn't erase responsibility. If one partner is making huge life decisions while missing information that could change everything, the silence becomes part of the story too. That is why this episode feels emotionally complicated instead of simply placing one person in the wrong and the other in the right. Sympathy and accountability exist together here. As Mallorie continued opening up, viewers finally learned where some of those fears came from. She spoke about her childhood and the painful memories she still carries. Previous episodes hinted at difficult experiences with her family, but this time she shared much more. She described growing up without healthy examples of parenting. She said her mother's drinking and unstable relationships left lasting scars. She also explained that her father showed little interest in her life, even after a serious accident that almost took her life. According to Mallorie, he never visited her in hospital and still had not seen her afterwards. Those experiences help explain why becoming a parent feels frightening to her. If your earliest memories of family involve instability and emotional distance, the thought of creating your own family carries a different weight. Instead of imagining happy milestones, some people first worry about repeating painful patterns. That doesn't automatically decide anyone's future, but it helps explain the emotions behind the hesitation. Many viewers found themselves feeling genuine compassion while listening to her story. Wanting to avoid repeating childhood trauma isn't something to mock. It comes from pain that doesn't disappear simply because someone falls in love. Understanding her fear doesn't automatically solve the bigger problem waiting at home, because Rash has been planning his future too. He left his own country believing both of them shared similar goals. Marriage means building a life together, and major decisions about family belong near the top of that list. Whatever his response turns out to be, he deserves the chance to make it with the full picture in front of him. That is why this conversation matters so much. It isn't only about children. It is about trust. It is about timing. It is about whether love survives after a truth arrives years later than it should have. By the time Mallorie returned home, she looked emotionally exhausted. She even tried making Rash some Turkish tea before asking him to sit outside with her. Rash quickly noticed something was wrong. He could see the tension on her face long before she spoke. She took a breath, looked at him, and quietly admitted there was something they needed to talk about. Something she had been carrying for far too long. Rash could tell this was not another small disagreement. The moment they sat down together, the atmosphere felt different. Mallorie looked nervous. She admitted her friends had encouraged her to stop avoiding this conversation, because keeping it inside any longer would only make things worse. Even before she explained what was bothering her, she warned him that what she was about to say might change everything between them. Rash responded with reassurance instead of panic. He told her he loved her. He told her he still wanted to marry her. From his point of view, there was nothing she could say that would change how he felt. It was an honest reaction from someone who believed they were facing another obstacle they would solve together. What happened next completely changed the direction of their relationship. Mallorie finally said the words she had been carrying for years. She was not sure she wanted children. The silence afterwards spoke almost as loudly as the confession itself. Rash looked stunned. A few seconds earlier he had been promising nothing would change. Now he was trying to process information that touched every plan he had made for his future. For him, this was never a small disagreement. Children are not something couples negotiate halfway through raising a family. They are one of the biggest decisions people make before building a life together. Hearing uncertainty about something so important, only weeks before the wedding, would leave almost anyone questioning where they stood. At first, Rash tried to find hope. He wondered whether her feelings might change after marriage. He searched for a solution because people often do that before accepting painful news. When someone you love shares something difficult, your first instinct is often to fix the situation instead of accepting that there may not be an easy answer. Mallorie did not give him false reassurance. She stayed honest about her uncertainty. That honesty deserved credit. The timing did not. This was the point where two different truths collided head-on. Mallorie had every right to be uncertain about becoming a parent. Nobody should feel pressured into making such a life-changing decision. Childhood experiences shape people in different ways, and her fears came from real experiences she had openly shared. Rash also had every right to know this before leaving his home, his country, and the life he had built for himself. Those two truths exist together. Supporting one does not erase the other. The biggest problem was not uncertainty about children. The biggest problem was waiting until the relationship had reached its final stage before sharing it. As that reality settled in, Rash's emotions changed. Confusion turned into frustration. He asked the question many viewers were already thinking. Why had she never told him before? His reaction did not come from a place of anger alone. It came from the feeling that major decisions had already been made without complete information. He had crossed borders believing both of them were working toward the same future. In his mind, the foundation of that future shifted within a single conversation. He admitted something that hit especially hard. If he had known this before leaving Turkey, he said he would not have come. That sentence explained everything. It was not only about children anymore. It was about choice. People deserve the chance to make life-changing decisions with honesty on the table. Trust is hardest to rebuild when someone believes their choices were made without the full story. Mallorie apologized, but apologies rarely erase years of silence in a few minutes. Rash became emotional, stood up, and walked away from the conversation. He needed space to process what had happened because the relationship he thought he understood suddenly looked unfamiliar. Watching the scene unfold, it was difficult not to feel sympathy for both of them. Mallorie looked heartbroken because she feared losing someone she loved after finally telling the truth. Rash looked heartbroken because he believed the truth had arrived far too late. Neither person looked like they wanted this outcome. Yet both were living with the consequences of delayed honesty. As one relationship reached its most painful turning point, another couple was quietly moving toward a similar crossroads. The details were different. The emotions were not. Across the country, Marissa was spending time away from Edward in New York. She said she needed space. Edward, meanwhile, was reaching a conclusion of his own. After weeks of trying to keep the relationship together, he was no longer willing to stay silent. For the first time since arriving in America, he decided he had reached his limit. Marissa arrived in New York without Edward, explaining that work brought her there and that she needed time apart. On paper, a few days of space might not sound unusual. Plenty of couples spend time apart. What made this situation different was the timing. They were only weeks away from a wedding, yet she felt relief being in another city without the man she was supposed to be preparing to marry. That alone raised a difficult question about where this relationship was heading. Even while planning one of the biggest days of her life, Marissa admitted she wasn't excited about the wedding itself. The plans continued because they had to, and one of those plans was her final wedding dress fitting. Walking into the boutique, she looked more enthusiastic than viewers had seen her in quite some time. She smiled while trying on the dress, accepted compliments from her friends, and looked genuinely pleased with her choice. For a brief moment, everything looked like the wedding was back on track. Then the conversation shifted away from dresses. Her friends had been watching the relationship from the outside, and they weren't convinced everything was as solid as it should be. One comment stood out. They hoped she had made the right decision. That opened the door to a much bigger conversation than anyone expected. Marissa admitted she still had doubts. Not small doubts. Not ordinary wedding nerves. She estimated she was only about 75% sure about getting married. That number hung in the air because marriage is not something most people approach with 1/4 of their confidence missing. Even she recognized there were problems between them. She admitted she often treated Edward harshly, yet almost immediately shifted back into explaining everything she believed he was doing wrong. According to Marissa, Edward relied on her too much. She described feeling overwhelmed by his need for reassurance and communication. She wanted more independence inside the relationship, and felt pressure whenever she believed she had to check in with him. From her perspective, the relationship had become emotionally exhausting. From Edward's perspective, it looked very different. Two people were living inside the same relationship while experiencing completely different realities. Her friends offered advice many viewers likely agreed with. If she was not fully committed to the marriage, she should seriously think before walking down the aisle. A wedding does not solve uncertainty. It usually magnifies it. Meanwhile, Edward was going through his own emotional shift. For weeks, many viewers had watched him trying to keep the peace, adjusting to life in a new country, and making sacrifices because he believed the relationship deserved every chance possible. This time, though, something had changed. He stopped focusing only on keeping Marissa happy and started asking whether he was happy himself. That was an important turning point. He traveled to New York because he wanted an honest conversation instead of another argument built on misunderstandings. When they finally met, he spoke openly about feeling emotionally neglected. He explained that simple moments mattered to him. Being left without a goodbye before Marissa traveled. Feeling unwanted. Feeling as though asking for affection had become something he needed permission to do. Those feelings were difficult to dismiss because they came from his own experience. Marissa responded by saying she could not give him the affection he wanted because their relationship was already struggling. She described a lack of connection between them and questioned whether they were still compatible. From her perspective, emotional distance was the result of deeper issues that had been growing since Edward arrived. That doesn't automatically make either person completely right or completely wrong. Relationships rarely collapse because only one person makes mistakes. Still, accountability matters. Edward acknowledged what he needed instead of pretending everything was fine. Marissa acknowledged her doubts, but many viewers questioned why those doubts were surfacing so close to the wedding rather than much earlier. Timing once again became the biggest character in the story. Then came the moment that changed the conversation completely. Marissa admitted she was questioning whether they were even the right fit for marriage. Edward looked shocked because he had traveled there hoping to repair the relationship, not to hear that the wedding itself might not happen. As she continued explaining that every wedding payment made her wonder whether the ceremony would even take place, Edward reached his breaking point. One question finally came out, and it echoed the same pain Rash had expressed earlier. Why wasn't I told before I moved here? One question ended up connecting both relationships, even though the situations looked completely different on the surface. Why did the truth arrive so late? Rash and Edward reacted differently throughout their journeys, but both reached the same emotional destination. They left their homes, packed their lives into suitcases, and committed themselves to building a future with the women they loved. Neither expected every day to be perfect. Every relationship faces disagreements. What neither of them expected was finding out, so close to the wedding, that major pieces of the future were still uncertain. Sometimes one conversation changes everything, not because of what is said, but because of when it is finally said. Mallorie's fear came from a deeply personal place. She spoke openly about painful childhood experiences, and how those memories shaped the way she viewed motherhood. Those feelings deserved compassion. Nobody chooses the family they grow up in, and fears rooted in childhood often stay with people for years. Watching her struggle to say the words showed how difficult that moment was for her. Marissa's situation carried a different kind of fear. Instead of worrying about becoming a parent, she seemed unsure whether the relationship itself could give her the happiness she wanted. She admitted she was questioning the marriage while wedding plans continued around her. That uncertainty was honest, but hearing it so late left Edward wondering how long those thoughts had been growing. Neither story fits into a simple category where one person becomes the hero and the other becomes the villain. Real relationships rarely work like that. People make decisions out of fear. People stay silent because they worry about losing someone. People hope difficult conversations will somehow become easier tomorrow. Tomorrow eventually runs out. That is where both couples found themselves. Love struggled against silence, and silence had been building long before the cameras arrived. The men also shared something important beyond frustration. Both believed they were making life-changing sacrifices for relationships built on complete honesty. Rash crossed continents believing he understood the future waiting for him. Edward left his own country believing he and Marissa were working toward the same destination. When new information arrived after those sacrifices had already been made, their disappointment became easier to understand. At the same time, their partners were carrying emotional burdens that were impossible to ignore. Mallorie feared repeating painful family history. Marissa questioned whether marriage would solve problems she already felt inside the relationship. Those concerns deserved to be voiced. The timing became the issue. That is why this episode felt less like an argument and more like a lesson about communication. Late honesty is still honesty, but late honesty often arrives carrying consequences that early honesty might have avoided. Trust grows through transparency. Once people begin wondering what else they never knew, rebuilding confidence becomes much harder. This episode never claimed love had disappeared. It showed what happens when trust begins to crack. Both couples walked into difficult conversations hoping for understanding. Both walked away facing bigger questions than the ones they brought with them. The weddings suddenly became secondary. The real question became whether trust still had enough time left. Right now, nothing has been settled. No final decisions have been confirmed, and the future of both relationships still hangs in the balance based on the events shown so far. The visa countdown keeps moving. Wedding plans remain in motion. Emotional wounds are still fresh. One couple must decide whether a painful truth shared late is enough to rebuild a future together. The other must decide whether months of growing distance can still be repaired before promises become permanent. Those answers have not arrived yet. And with both weddings standing on uncertain ground, the next chapter carries even more pressure because the conversations are over. The truth is finally on the table, and now everyone has to live with what comes next.